If one day at the age of nearly 40 you step down to a strange train station and the first look the world gives you is one of ridicule, what will you do? In Cedar Hollow, in the bitter winds of late 19th century Montana, Clara Whitmore, a woman considered late to life, experienced the moment no one wanted to face. The whispers, the stares, the half-smiles, all seemed to suggest that her age was a mistake. But in the midst of that brutal moment, something happened, something soft enough to be silent but powerful enough to change a man's destiny. Elias Hartman, the quiet man from the West, stepped forward to face the crowd, and with a single word he silenced them all. "You're timeless to me. If it were you humiliated in front of the whole town, then suddenly defended by a stranger, would you believe it? Or would you run away from the place that seemed destined to reject you?" Today's story is not just about love gone too late. It's about courage, about dignity, and about whether each of us dares to believe in a second chance. Even when the world says it's too late, we invite you to join us on this gentle journey, one that may leave you speechless and feeling warm to the heart. If you love humane stories like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The early spring wind in Montana is never gentle, and that morning it whipped Clara Whitmore's cheeks as if testing how much more chill the 8-year-old's heart could endure. The train from the east had just rumbled to a stop at Cedar Hollow station, leaving behind a hazy haze of steam mixed with coal dust that momentarily obscured Clara's figure. When the smoke cleared, one saw a thin woman standing slightly hunched, clutching an old leather suitcase, her eyes deep and tired, as if she had passed her prime with nothing but a few unnamed wounds. Clara stepped off the platform and immediately felt the cold creep up her collar, sharp and real enough to make her shiver. But the cold was nothing compared to the feeling of being pushed aside for years, a feeling she had carried with her to Cedar Hollow like unwanted baggage that was hard to leave behind. She didn't look at anyone, but she was aware of their eyes on her. In border towns, newcomers were always scrutinized, but the look she received was different. Judgment, a little pity, and most of all, suspicion of a woman who had arrived too late. A grocery store lady leaned against the door, her arms crossed, tilting her head to the side, examining Clara as if she were an out-of-season item, something that had arrived at the wrong time and no one wanted to buy. To the right of the platform, a group of younger women, their hair tied up and their skirts brand new, were in the middle of a conversation that suddenly fell silent when they saw Clara. A second later, whispers broke out, mixed with the wind. "He ordered a young bride," one voice whispered, but deliberately loud. "Not a out-of-date teacher." Another voice chuckled, deliberately emphasizing the words past her spring. Clara heard it all. She didn't need anyone to explain. She knew her 38 years were easy fodder for jokes. In places like Cedar Hollow, women were considered too old, too early. People expected the bride to be young, smooth-skinned, clear-eyed, a symbol of hope, not a woman who had worked herself to the point of calluses, whose faith had been scarred by life. A station attendant came over and handed her a registration book asking for her name. Clara spoke clearly, but he curled his lips and read it as Clara Whitless. Not an accident, but on purpose. A humiliating twist. The woman has nothing to be proud of. The women nearby burst out laughing. Clara froze. For a moment she wanted to turn around and climb back onto the train before it whistled away. But her feet felt glued to the icy ground. She had left home because she knew no one wanted her there anymore. She had come here despite her reservations because on paper somewhere in Cedar Hollow there was a man who had agreed to marry a late woman like her, a man she had never met but who was kind enough to write a few short, warm letters, making Clara believe she could start over. But now, standing amid the mocking laughter, Clara suddenly found herself back where she started being overlooked, undervalued, considered inadequate. The wind blew again harder, tossing her hair across her forehead. Clara pulled her cloak closer to her body, trying to keep her posture steady. The woman, tired, hurt, laughed at, kept a proud silence. Older Americans will know what it feels like when they've grown accustomed to being looked down upon because life hasn't been kind to them at the right time. The train pulled out of the station, leaving Clara standing in a circle of strangers, feeling as if she had been pushed out of her rightful part of the world by the Montana wind. At 38, one should have felt calmer, but Clara saw only a vast expanse of loneliness spread out before her. A sigh rose in her heart. What am I doing here? That question touched her mind like a thin mist. That moment when she almost believed she had gone astray, had come to the wrong place at the wrong time, was the defining moment of what would happen next. Because when people are on the verge of wanting to turn back, sometimes God quietly places before them a reason strong enough to keep going. Clara didn't know that. She just stood there trying to keep her shoulders straight while her heart clenched with the gossip. She knew all too well what it felt like to be seen as late as a poor bargain, as if the future had been closed to her. The older listeners, those who had lived enough, would understand the pain deeply. Not the kind that makes you cry, but the kind that makes you stay silent for a while longer. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp pine and smoke from the log cabins down in the valley. Cedar Hollow opened up before Clara, rolling prairie to the foothills, curved porches, makeshift picket fences. It was beautiful in a rustic way, but also harsh in a way only those who had endured much could understand. She stood there in the cold iron sky with the old suitcase at her feet and thought, if they didn't want me, would the man waiting for me really want him? A strong wind blew by, bringing with it giggles from the group of young women. One of them spoke loud enough for Clara to hear, her voice tinged with malice. He will be disappointed to see her. Clara wanted to turn away, but her feet remained glued to the spot. Perhaps because, after all, one still wanted to believe in a last ray of hope, however small. She swallowed her bitterness, reminding herself that if God had let her live this long, there must be something ahead. But this morning, in the windy Cedar Hollow that seemed hard to believe, a distant clatter of hooves echoed steady and slow, like the way a man accustomed to living in silence went about his life without fanfare. The crowd turned slightly. The wind carried a thin dust, and in the dust a figure on horseback gradually became visible, its shadow long on the gravel. Clara didn't know, but the moment that man appeared was also the moment the wind changed direction in her life. And just when Clara thought Cedar Hollow was out to get her, the sound of horse hooves suddenly stopped in front of the train station, as if fate had chosen the perfect moment to bring into her life a man calm enough to change everything. The horse's hooves finally stopped right in front of Clara, soft but steady, like the footsteps of someone accustomed to living in a vast land where silence was the language of the day. As the dust from the trail settled, the man's shape gradually became clear, tall, lean, his dark leather jacket coated with Montana dust, and his posture in the saddle so sure it made the air around him stand still. He stepped down slowly, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck to calm it before letting go. His shadow stretched across the platform, weaving in the weak morning light. Strangely, in that moment, the giggles that had been surrounding Clara all fell silent. It was as if his presence, calm, casual, yet powerful, made the sarcasm that had been lurking in the distance retreat. Clara didn't know where to look. She tried to convince herself that he was just another of the many unfamiliar faces on the border, but his footsteps came straight toward her without hesitation. He straightened his cowboy hat, revealing a tanned face, the face of someone who had lived on the prairie too long to know that words mattered only when absolutely necessary. As he approached, he inclined his head slightly, bowing slightly, as if he were treating a woman as someone worthy of respect, not someone to be gossiped about. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low, not loud, but clear through the wind. Clara nodded, her hands unconsciously tightening on the suitcase strap. He smiled, a smile so slight you had to look closely to see it, but the warmth in it was unmistakable. "I'm Elias Hartman," he said. "I'm here to pick you up." She heard the words, and for a moment her heart skipped a beat. This was the man who had written those short, thoughtful, heartfelt letters, the man who had proposed a practical, quiet marriage to rebuild the farm after the failed winter. A marriage not romantic but decent. She had feared that when he saw her he would be disappointed. A man from the West who had worked outdoors all his life. He could have chosen a young, healthy girl ready to bear children and take care of the farm. Instead, he chose her, a woman in her late 40s, carrying with her the years that had faded. And so Clara didn't dare look up. She knew her eyes were streaked with time. She knew her wounds weren't easy to hide. But when she looked at him cautiously, the first thing she saw wasn't disappointment. It was calm. A calm that was almost comforting. A few townspeople stood behind her watching, waiting for Elias's reaction, hoping he would frown or sigh or show some hesitation at the late delivery. But no. Elias just stood there, his gaze straight and warm, as if the woman standing before him wasn't a mistake of fate, but a part of it. A young woman in the distance whispered loud enough to be annoying, "I wonder if he realizes her age." Elias heard. It was obvious his shoulders stiffened for a split second, but he didn't turn to respond. Instead, he turned to Clara and said, in a voice as deep and steady as the ground of Cedar Hollow, "You've come a long way. We should get out of here. The wind is getting colder." The sentence was as simple as breathing, but for Clara it made her eyes burn. The only thing he cared about was her comfort, not the gossip around. Elias bent down, picked up the glove she had dropped without her realizing it, and brushed it off before handing it back. The small gesture, so light, so unobtrusive, brought a strange silence to the crowd. In an age when women like Clara were looked down upon, the respect of a man like Elias was rare. She tried to smile, but it was crooked with simmering worry. I was afraid you would be disappointed." Elias tilted his head. His eyes seemed to listen to the deepest part of her heart. "Clara," he said softly, "I expect nothing but the truth from men, and your truth does not disappoint me." She didn't know what to say. His words weren't honeyed words, but they were the sincerity her long-neglected heart needed. Older Americans accustomed to simpler words rather than flowery ones would understand that sometimes just one well-timed word is enough to make a person want to stand up straight. Elias gestured for her to go ahead, but when he saw her fumbling with the heavy suitcase, he took it without invitation. The gesture was simple, yet as strong as the way he held his horse's reins. No urgency, no pressure, just quiet, trustworthy assistance. Clara walked beside him, and for the first time since stepping off the platform at Cedar Hollow, she no longer felt like she was being pushed to the edge of the world by the whole town. Not because the town had changed, but because the man beside her had given her a place to stand amidst the harsh gazes. As they left the platform, the whispers behind them were still there. But the distance between her and them had grown, as if the Montana wind had finally changed direction. Cedar Hollow was as cold, as wild, as harsh as the morning she'd arrived. But in the silence of the woods, Elias's presence beside her created a slow warmth, a warmth that only broken hearts could recognize. And just when they thought they were far from gossip, a bitter voice suddenly rang out from behind, initiating the moment that would redefine both of their fates. The moment where Elias had to stand up straight, not to prove anything, but protect the dignity of the woman who had just appeared in his life. The wind on the Cedar Hollow platform picked up as Clara and Elias took a few steps away from the crowd. She had thought she could escape the gossip behind her back, but the harshness of the frontier town never disappeared so easily. A young woman's voice, clear but sharp as a thin knife blade, rang out. "Poor Mr. Hartman. He must have thought he would get a younger bride." A burst of laughter followed, fragile as thin ice, but enough to shatter the self-esteem of a woman who had gone through half her life like Clara. She paused. Her fingers dropped from the handle of the suitcase. Her face dropped as if trying to find a place to put her shame without making a sound. Cedar Hollow had not changed its opinion of her, and perhaps Elias would not stay out of the gossip forever. In that moment, Clara felt so small she wanted to disappear back to the old train car, back east, back to a life where no one wanted her. She didn't have the youth, the freshness that people wanted in a bride. She knew it, but hearing it said so openly, so harshly, made her knees weak. "Elias," she called softly, her voice almost inaudible. Maybe I should go back." But before she could take a step, Elias's hand found hers, slowly but surely, like the way one places a new beam of wood into an old foundation so it won't collapse in the first wind of the season. He held her hand not to stop her, but to tell her that she was no longer alone. The crowd turned to them, waiting amused, even hoping Elias would change his tune. But he did not choose the safe silence that many Western men did when they were being ridiculed. Elias turned, placing Clara slightly behind his shoulder, and looked straight at the laughing group. There was no anger in his eyes, just an unapproachable calm, a calm that made even the loudest voices wary. "I hear what you say," Elias said, his voice low but clear on the Montana wind. "But you're wrong." A heavy silence fell. The small town seemed to wait for what he would say next. Elias squeezed Clara's hand gently, then continued, "She's not young." "That's true." He paused, letting the truth sink in. "But to me, she's timeless." He turned to look at Clara, his gaze so warm it made the wind around them seem to calm. "She is timeless to me. To me, she transcends age." And then he concluded, his voice as firm as footsteps on an old wooden floor. "And that's all that matters." No one laughed anymore. The wind blew across the platform but carried no murmur. Clara felt like her heart was breaking, not because she was hurt, but because no one had ever stood up for her like that. People had always seen her with standards she couldn't meet, young, beautiful, soft, carefree, but Elias saw her differently. He saw the journey, the endurance, the things that only those who had endured and still lived well could maintain. A disgruntled snort came from the left. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a scraggly beard stepped forward. His gaze was as long as the morning shadows. "Elias Hartman," he chuckled. "I didn't think you'd be so desperate as to choose this. Clara heard the voice, and her heart sank. Though no one had said it outright, she sensed there was something between Elias and this man, an old rivalry perhaps, or a deeper disagreement. The man's mocking gaze seemed to cut to the very point Clara feared most, that Elias had chosen her only because he had no better options. Elias looked at him for a long moment, but instead of responding angrily, he just said slowly, "There are things you won't understand, Raymond. Not because it's difficult, but because you've never valued anything beyond the surface of things." Raymond curled his lips but did not reply. There was a long silence, and then he walked away, his footsteps heavy on the gravel. The crowd of onlookers dispersed, no one saying anything more. Only Elias and Clara remained standing in the middle of the wide platform where the wind was carrying a chill but also seemed to open a new path. Clara looked at her hand, the hand in Elias's, as if she couldn't believe it was real. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "People will think you're foolish." Elias shook his head. "Clara, you come from a place where there is more pain than joy. I see that, but I also see the resilience in your eyes. That resilience knows no age." He stopped, then spoke softly, like a sigh of the steppe. "You and I are both looking for a place to start over. I don't need a young bride. I need someone real." Those words for Clara not only soothed her but lifted her up from the broken pieces of herself. The older listener will know that feeling well when dignity is defended by another, not by violence but by the steadfastness of heart. The wind blew, carrying with it the unexpected warmth of the sun peeking over the mountains. Cedar Hollow was still harsh, but that morning felt a little softer, a sign that life sometimes knew how to give people what they thought they didn't deserve a chance. And as Elias led Clara away from the Cedar Hollow train station, heading down the dirt road to the Hartman farm, she had no idea that the journey would open a new chapter. No fuss, no drama, but gentle enough to touch the deepest part of a weary heart. The road from Cedar Hollow station to Elias's farm stretched across fields, bathed in the pale late morning light. The wind still blew, but as Clara walked beside Elias, it was not as sharp as when she stood alone on the platform. It was softer, as if nature had also witnessed the moment the man stood up to defend her dignity, and then quietly changed its attitude. They walked slowly. The dirt road was dry and cracked from the long winter, mixed with the scent of early spring grass, the smoke from distant roofs, and the sounds of the frontier wind, dry branches rubbing against each other, horses breathing evenly. Clara remained silent for most of the journey, but not out of shyness. It was the kind of silence that allowed the heart to rest, after being strained by so much self-consciousness. As they rounded a low hill, Elias's cabin came into view. It was not large or beautiful by the standards of prosperous farms, but there was something about it, a presence that had stood the test of wind, snow, and years of hardship. The pine was faded, the eaves slanted, but it still held the warmth of the hard-working hands that had built it. Clara paused. The house was too quiet, too real, too domestic, a concept she had not dared to approach for many years. "This is my home," Elias said, but immediately corrected himself, his eyes softening. "And if you want, it can be our home." A simple word, but enough to untie every knot in Clara's heart. As they drew nearer, a huge dog, its fur as thick as winter snow, suddenly rushed out from around the corner of the porch. It barked loudly, not with ferocity but with joy at the return of its master. "Calm down, Bear," Elias said, but his voice was far from stern. The dog circled Clara, sniffing, then suddenly nuzzled her leg as if they had known each other for a long time. Clara let out a small laugh, her first since arriving in Cedar Hollow. A small, shaky laugh, but genuine. "Bear has a good eye for people," Elias said, his hand unconsciously touching her waist to make sure she wasn't scared off by the dog. "If he takes a liking to someone right away, that means they have a good heart." Clara didn't know how to respond. She just bent down and stroked the dog's head, feeling a little relieved. Elias led her into the house. Inside, everything was simple but made with care by hands that respected labor. Hand-hewn wooden tables and chairs, imperfect but sturdy. Wall shelves made from sawn and half-pine trunks. A hand-woven reddish-brown rug underfoot, worn but clean. On the bench lay several old quilts, the stitching uneven but delicate. Clara touched one lightly, and Elias said, "My mother made them." Each stitch was her way of fighting off the sadness after a hard winter. He paused, as if the memory still held weight. "I keep them not because they are beautiful," he said slowly, "but because they remind me that warmth can always be created with your hands, no matter how harsh the times." Clara fell silent. Those words weren't just about Elias's mother. They were about her too, the woman who tried to build a life with her hands, even though no one truly appreciated what she had to offer. Elias opened a small door at the end of the hall. "I have a private room prepared for you," he said, "if you need time or space to yourself." A rare respect at that time when many men on the border considered women's reserve to be superfluous. The room was small, just enough for a wooden bed, a low chest of drawers, and a window that opened onto the prairie. But on the bedside table there was something that made Clara stop breathing for a few seconds, an old Bible, its leather cover worn, its corners faded. She opened it, and handwritten notes appeared, soft, italicized, full of faith, with occasional prayers for her son, for the harvest, for peace. "My mother," Elias said softly when he saw her eyes, "always wrote down a few words for the days when she wanted to be a little stronger." Clara smoothed the page. "You seem to be a woman of great faith. So big that I still rely on it," Elias replied. "And I think you need a place to put your new faith too." In that moment Clara felt her heart soften like the earth after an early spring rain. This house, with its rustic furnishings, its loyal dog, its notes from her late mother, created a sense of home she thought she would never experience again. Standing by the window looking out at the pale yellow fields, Clara realized there are places that do not promise ease, but they promise peace. There are people who do not say much, but whose presence heals more than any words. And Elias, by preparing a private room, by keeping a tactful enough distance, gave her what no one had given her for years, the right to be safe in her own skin. And then, as Clara began to fold the quilt, her hands lingering on her dead mother's old needles, she knew one thing for sure. The coming days, the first 10 days at Hartman Homestead, would be not only a challenge but also an opportunity for her heart to learn to trust life again. The first days at Hartman Homestead passed at the slow pace of the frontier. The sunrises came slowly, the sun spread across the prairies inch by inch, and the wind never stopped. But for Clara, those 10 days felt like a different time, not exactly new, but enough to feel like she was slowly finding warmth in a place that had seemed cold. The first morning she woke earlier than Elias. The pink light of dawn filtered through the coarse curtains, softening the small room. When she stepped out into the yard, she saw the backyard garden, a large area overrun by weeds. Old flower stalks were withered, a few vegetable beds had been abandoned from the previous season, and the soil was hard from neglect. Somehow the sight made Clara want to do something. Maybe because the garden was like herself, tired, barren, neglected, but still holding a glimmer of hope if only someone would pay attention. She rolled up her sleeves, found her tools in the shed, and set to work pulling weeds, clearing leaves, and gathering rotten logs. The work was hard, but the repetition calmed her mind. From the porch, Elias stood still for a moment, watching. He didn't call her in, nor did he make any attempt to appear to be in a position to help. He just looked, and then a small, discreet smile appeared on his face. A very Western man's smile, small but deep. No one had ever smiled proudly at Clara for such small things. And sometimes it was the simple things that touched people's hearts more than the big words. On the third day, Elias led her out to the fields. He wanted to teach her to ride the gray horse that had served him for many years, Silverwind. He was a smart, gentle mare, but could easily startle an unconfident rider. "Let it feel your breath," Elias said, standing close enough so she wouldn't feel out of place but still respecting her distance. Clara ran her hand through Silverwind's soft fur, trying to calm her heart. It had been a long time since she had ridden a horse, not since she was a child playing behind a school in the countryside. "Let it know you don't want to control, just accompany," Elias continued. "The way he talks about horses is like the way he treats people, no pressure, no push, just companionship." After a few awkward moments, she finally managed to sit firmly in the saddle. Silverwind walked slowly. The wind blew through Clara's hair, and she felt like she was opening up an old memory, a memory when she believed she could be anything. When she turned back, she saw Elias looking at her, his smile still light, but his eyes contained something like pride. That feeling made Clara's heart strangely warm. On Friday evening, the prairie wind changed direction, carrying with it a long, distant howl. Such sounds are familiar to people from the West, but to Clara, who had lived in the city for many years, it was the call of loneliness. It got dark quickly. The darkness outside the window was as thick as a black woolen blanket. Clara sat on the bed, her hands trembling slightly. The darkness reminded her of the time when her youth was filled with doubts. "You're not good enough. You're not fit to be a teacher. You're too old to start." The memories weren't as sharp as before, but they could still make her choke. A light knock sounded. The door was ajar, and Elias stood there holding an oil lamp. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" as many people would out of politeness. He just walked in, set the lamp on the bedside table, and pulled a chair closer. He sat down, quietly, not touching her, not intruding on her thoughts. Just present. Clara said nothing. It took her a long moment to realize that Elias's silence didn't embarrass her. It calmed her, as if in the darkness she wasn't alone. There are people who bring peace with words, but there are people like Elias who bring peace simply by their presence. That night, as Elias stood up to leave, Clara stopped him with a small, breathy sentence. "Thank you for being there." He nodded, his eyes gentle. "We all have nights like that, Clara. No one has to go through them alone." 10 days passed in those slow rhythms, working together, sharing a simple dinner, talking about the past. Clara, talking about her teaching job that was taken away. Elias, talking about his wife who died in the snowstorm, and about the things that still kept them standing until now. No promises, no demands. Just two people learning to trust each other little by little. And as the 10th day came to a close, Clara felt something she never thought possible. Her heart stopped being afraid. It began to open. And just when Clara thinks the peaceful days at Hartman Homestead will help things settle down, Elias brings her back to Cedar Hollow, where their real test awaits amid prying eyes and prejudice that won't easily subside. After 10 days at Hartman Homestead, 10 days of simple meals, small but meaningful tasks, moments of silence warm enough to feel like life had never turned its back, Clara thought Cedar Hollow might look at her differently. Not respectfully, but at least less harshly. That morning, Elias prepared the horse to take her into town to buy some supplies. The sky was clear, the wind was light, and the distant mountains were cast in golden light. Clara wore the woolen scarf. Mrs. Hartman had sewn years ago, feeling the warmth of a family she was slowly learning to belong to. As they set off, the familiar dirt road opened up again, but this time, Clara felt no fear. Maybe it was because Elias rode so close, or because the past few days had awakened in her a quiet strength she thought she had lost. But maybe it was because it was the slow spark between them that was growing like a small fire in a winter fireplace, steady, real, without excuse. However, Cedar Hollow always knows how to test people's hearts. The town was busier than usual. People were pouring out of taverns, shops, and the little church at the end of the street. Curious eyes immediately turned to Elias and Clara's horses. A few men tipped their hats to Elias, but their eyes still glanced at Clara as if to see how much youth she had left. The women stopped what they were doing to look at her from head to toe. Clara felt those eyes more clearly than the wind blowing on her collar. She gently tightened her grip on the handle of her basket of groceries before following Elias into the town's largest grocery store. The wooden door creaked open. The space inside smelled of freshly ground coffee and old linens on the shelves. Behind the counter stood the shop's owner, Martha Lehman, a woman with a sharp temper like a meat cleaver, known for her ability to tell a person's worth at a glance. "Mrs." Lehman glanced at Clara, then jerked her chin with a sarcastic smile. "Oh. Is this her? I thought Mr. Hartman would bring a younger bride." She eyed Clara as if she were judging the quality of an old roll of cloth. "She's almost 40, Elias. Why the rush?" Her voice was sweet but thorny, like honey kept for a long time in a cracked jar. Clara lowered her head, her lips trembling slightly. Those words, though Clara was used to hearing them, still touched a wound that years could not erase. In the past, she usually kept silent to protect what remained of her dignity, but today what made her tremble was not shame but fear that Elias would have to bear the ridicule just because he chose her. Elias placed the bag of flour on the counter, his eyes slowly lifted to look straight at Mrs. Lehman. "Mrs. Lehman," he said, his voice calm but heavy like a hammer on dry wood, "when a man finds a woman worthy of him—" He paused, turning to look at Clara, his gaze not only gentle but also deeply proud. "He does not hesitate." The people in the shop fell silent, not because the statement was too flowery, but because it came from a man of few words like Elias, a man whose words always contained truth. Clara felt her eyes sting. Deserved. The words spoken in the town that had laughed at her made her heart open in a strange, warm breeze. But Cedar Hollow never makes it easy to have a moment of complete peace. As they were picking out some cloth and salt, a drunken man staggered in. His name was Cordell Briggs, who was known for his drinking and his disrespectful mouth. He looked Clara up and down, the smirk appearing like an ugly crack. Oh, Elias Hartman brought his Lady again. He approached Clara, his breath heavy with alcohol. Not bad. If you like older women. He raised his hand to touch Clara's shoulder. Everything happens in a moment. Elias didn't shout, didn't act aggressive. He just took one long, quick, decisive step, his hand grabbing Cordell's wrist, twisting gently but firmly, forcing him back a step. That's enough, Cordell. Elias's voice was low, not loud, but it silenced the entire shop. Don't touch her. Cordell paused, surprised by the calm strength. He withdrew his hand, backed away a little, cursed under his breath, and walked out. No one said anything for a moment, as if everyone was afraid to break the tense atmosphere. Mrs. Lehman, the sharpest woman in town, tweaked her apron, avoiding Clara's gaze. Several other customers leaned forward, pretending to browse. Only Elias turned back to Clara, his eyes checking to see if she was okay. Are you okay, Clara? She nodded, but her hands still trembled slightly. Though Cordell hadn't touched her, the insult was as fresh in her heart as a draft through an open door. I'm sorry, Elias said softly. Cedar Hollow can be rude sometimes. You don't have to apologize for them, Clara replied, her voice low but firm. I'm just not used to someone standing up for me like that. Elias looked at her, a slow, deep gaze like an autumn lake. Clara, I was only doing the right thing, he said. Your dignity is not for anyone to touch. In that moment, Clara sensed that Elias's certainty came not from outward strength, but from character. A character many Western men are taught from a young age to stand up for what they believe is right, not to protect their ego. Older listeners will see glimpses of a time they once lived in, a time when kindness was unobtrusive and honesty was the most precious thing a person could have. After finishing their purchases, Elias led Clara out of the store. The wind from the street blew gently through the curtains as if to ease the tension in the small space. On the way back to the horse tethers, a few townspeople tipped their hats to Clara, something they had never done before. Perhaps it was because they had just witnessed Elias stand up for her, or perhaps because in his eyes they saw the woman's worth. And sometimes a small town learns to look back at itself through the actions of a kind man. Clara walked more slowly, letting the wind carry away what remained of her trembling. Elias walked beside her, not touching but always close enough to let her know she was not alone. Elias, she called softly. Yes, thank you. He nodded slightly, the smile fleeting. A man only does right when he protects what is valuable, he said. You are that, Clara. She turned away to hide her eyes, which were heavy with emotion. Not pain, but gratitude, emotion, and a sense of being seen, something she thought she had lost after years of being ignored. By the time Elias helped her onto the horse, the sky had changed. Light clouds drifted toward the mountains, and the afternoon light bathed the town in a soft gold. Clara looked back at Cedar Hollow. The town had greeted her with doubt and laughter, but today she left it with something else, the knowledge that she no longer had to fend for herself. And sometimes a man just needs to say the right word at the right time, or take the right step in the right place to change a woman's destiny. And that very afternoon, as they left Cedar Hollow, Elias suddenly turned his horse toward the northern hills where the windless Silver Lake lay. Clara had no idea that there under the setting sun he would say the words that would change her heart forever. That afternoon, after leaving Cedar Hollow with confused and wary looks, Elias did not immediately take Clara back to the farm. Instead, he turned onto a small road heading north, a road Clara had never taken during her time at Hartman Homestead. The sun was setting, dyeing the steppe a soft hue like an old silk scarf. The wind blew through the dry grass, rustling like the whispers of a frontier. Clara sensed something different about Elias's riding. He wasn't in a hurry, but there was a deliberate slowness, as if he were leading her to a place more meaningful than she could have guessed. Where are we going, Elias? She asked softly, her voice as soft as the evening light. He didn't turn his head, but a smile appeared at the corner of his lips. It's not far, Clara. Just a place I thought you should see. His voice was low, mixed with the sound of the wind, but had a warmth that made her heart feel at ease. They continued on past the bronzed, grassy hills and the pines that stood silent like old gatekeepers of the West. The road led up to a high knoll where the wind grew stronger but also carried the scent of fresh water. And then when she reached the top of the hill, the view opened up before Clara's eyes. Silver Lake. A large lake, the water as clear as natural glass, reflected the sky that was gradually turning orange-red. The sunset slid across the water, sparkling like thousands of silver coins falling to the bottom. Everything was so quiet that Clara could hear her own breathing. She paused not because she was tired, but because that beauty touched her heart in a way she did not expect. Elias, she called softly. This place is so beautiful. He dismounted first, holding out his hand to help her. When her feet touched the ground, they stood side by side in the sacred silence created by nature. I've never brought anyone here before. Elias set his eyes on the lake. Not because I didn't want to, but because I never found a big enough reason. Clara turned to look at him, but he was still staring at Silver Lake as if he were looking into his own past. Every time I come here, he said slowly, I remember that life, no matter how cruel, no matter how much it takes from us, still leaves behind beautiful moments so that people can start again. He looked at Clara now, his gaze so deep and true that it made her feel like she was no longer standing in the wind but in the warmth of something lasting. Clara, he continued, I know you've suffered a lot. You've survived, you've stood strong, and you've kept going when no one was there for you. Clara bowed her head. No one had ever said those things to her with such reverence. You lived. You endured. And to me, his voice was low, as if to reach her heart without hurting it. That is a rare beauty. Clara felt her heart open slowly but deeply, like dry land meeting the first rain of the season. I'm not sure I deserve those words, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You don't need to be worthy of any words, Elias replied. You just need to be yourself. The rest, let me see. Those words, simple, unvarnished, but for Clara they were enough to tear down all the defenses she had built up over nearly 40 years. A gentle wind blew across the lake carrying a chill, but Elias's presence made her no longer feel alone in this vast scene. They walked down to the water's edge. The lake was as calm as a promise. The sunset cast their shadows on the grass side by side, merging and then parting like two lives once separated but finding their way back together. Elias. Clara called, her voice so low the wind almost carried it away. He turned back, looking at her as if he had been waiting for her to say something. Clara paused. Age wounds, past failures, it all made her want to cover her mouth to withdraw. But his gaze was so gentle that she felt she could speak her truth without fear of being hurt. I never thought I would be loved. Again. Elias stepped closer to her. Not in a hurry. Not forcing. Clara, he whispered, love comes neither early nor late. It only comes when the heart is calm enough to receive it. A gentle wind blew between them. And then, Elias lifted her hand, gently touching the calloused hand of someone who had worked hard all her life. I don't love a young girl, he said. I love a woman who has weathered storms and remained kind. I love what time cannot take away. Clara heard this and tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of pain. They were the kind of tears you cry when you find something you thought was lost forever. Elias bowed slightly, his eyes asking for permission, not taking advantage. And when Clara nodded, a small nod but one that held a lifetime of return, he placed a kiss on her lips. No rush, no passion. Just a slow kiss long enough to be etched into their lives as an unforgettable milestone. The sunset reflected on the surface of Silver Lake, the light trembling on the water as if blessing the couple standing there. Two hearts once broken now found each other in the silence of the border. Clara cried. But this time it wasn't sadness. That was the first time in her life she felt that love did not require her to be younger, more beautiful, or more talented. A love that only required her to be herself. Elias held her close, not too tight, not too suffocating, just enough to let her know she belonged here. Thank you, she whispered into his chest. Thank you for seeing me. Elias placed his hand on her hair, his voice like the late autumn wind. I only see what is real. And what is real in you is more beautiful than this sunset. They stood there for a long time in the sacred silence of Silver Lake, which from now on would no longer be just a lake, but a shared memory for the two of them. The memory of a fateful moment. And so that afternoon ended with the new moon rising over the lake as Elias took Clara's hand and returned to Hartman Homestead. She had no idea that just a few days later the whole of Cedar Hollow would witness a simple wedding, but for them it would be a moment as sacred as a promise written in life itself. After that moment at Silver Lake, the moment Clara knew her heart no longer belonged to the past, the days at Hartman Homestead took on a different, gentle tone. There was no grand engagement, no loud chatter. Just two people silently agreeing that they had found a place for their souls. One misty morning, Elias placed a bouquet of freshly picked wildflowers tied with a small hemp string before Clara. He didn't say much, just looked at her with a warm gaze. We should do this right, Clara, with God as our witness. With the community as our witness. She bowed her head slightly. A verbal agreement was not needed. Just the clasping of hands was enough. Cedar Hollow's little church sat on the south knoll, its pine walls faded, its porch roof collapsed in a corner from the previous winter's storm. The townspeople seldom attended church. The weariness of frontier life often made them forget Sunday services. But when word got out that Elias Hartman, a rough, serious man with a history of loss, was about to marry a woman as late as Clara Whitmore, they were curious. Not curious in a bad sense, but in the common Western way, wanting to know what's going on and sometimes wanting to see if it stands up. On the morning of the wedding, the church resounded with the sound of an old organ. The music was not full, some notes were out of breath, but it had its own warmth, like the sigh of a land that has witnessed many separations and reunions. Clara stood in a small room at the back of the church. The old dim vanity mirror reflected her imperfectly but clearly enough to see her eyes gleam with a strange light, faith and wonder. Mrs. Miller, the minister's wife, helped her pin the wildflowers to her bosom. "You are beautiful, Clara," she said, her voice soft as a sun-dried blanket. Not in a youthful way, but in a peaceful way. Clara smiled slightly. It was the first time in years that she didn't feel embarrassed in front of the mirror. Outside, the townspeople crowded the benches. They had not come to offer their blessings, at least not entirely. They had come out of curiosity to know what had led Elias Hartman, a man who had lived quietly for so many years, to decide to marry a woman who was no longer young, without a dowry, without a family. As the organ played slowly, Clara entered, her legs trembling slightly. The eyes of the entire town were on her. But strangely, what steadied her was not the music, not the prayer, but the sight of Elias waiting at the end of the aisle. That gaze lit up, not with pleasure, not with pride, but with faith. Faith in the woman walking towards him. Faith in the new life they were about to build together. The wedding ceremony proceeded slowly. The minister read Bible verses so familiar that many in the church could repeat them. But for Clara, each word felt like a stab at her old life, a life lost, shattered, but now given a chance to be put back together. As Elias lifted the thin veil from Clara's hair, a sudden gust of wind blew the church door open. The wooden door crashed against the wall with a loud bang. Many people turned back in panic. Some whispered, saying it was a bad omen. But Elias only held Clara's hand tighter. A small smile, a rare smile that only those who knew him well recognized, flickered across his tanned face. "A good wind carries blessings," he said softly, loud enough for the whole church to hear. "A good wind always carries God's blessings." The whispers died down at that. A few of the older men nodded as if they had believed it too in a distant time. Clara looked at Elias, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. Not because she was overly emotional, but because no one had ever protected her with such calm trust. When the pastor asked Elias, "Do you vow to keep the woman by your side for the rest of your life, in plenty or in want, in sickness and in health?" Elias looked at Clara as if she was the one answer he never needed to think about. "I wish." His voice echoed in the church like an echo off the mountainside, steady, steady, unshakable. When it was Clara's turn, her lip trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the realization that she was standing in a moment her entire life had never led her to before. "Do you wish?" Clara squeezed Elias's hand. "I wish," she said softly but clearly. As the couple exchanged rings, a gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of pine trees from the forest behind the church. The light poured in, not bright but warm, as the hand of God on their shoulders. And then, amid the silence of the entire community, the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. There was no cheering, no fireworks or confetti, just the sound of the wind, the soft creaking of wood, and the breathing of two people who had just shared the most sacred thing their lives had ever known. Elias bent down and gave Clara a light kiss full of respect. The church fell silent, not in protest, but because something softened in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Even Mrs. Lehman, the always difficult woman, had to soften her tone, as if admitting that sometimes God knows how to choose the right two people for each other. After the wedding, the people of Cedar Hollow filed out of the church with mixed emotions. A few young people giggled at the oddity, but the older ones lingered longer, looking at the newlyweds as if they were seeing something that reminded them of their own pasts, of imperfect but lasting marriages, of patience, of faith in goodness. Clara didn't hear any loud cheers, but she saw softer looks, nods of acceptance. For her, that was enough. Elias helped her down the church steps. Bear, the faithful dog, came running up, wagging his tail as if to share in his master's small joy. Clara smiled, placing her hand on his head, then turned to Elias. their hands intertwined as naturally as two streams meeting after many years of flowing separately. "Elias," she whispered. He looked at her. "Yeah, thank you for believing in me." Elias reached out to gently stroke the loose hair on her forehead, his voice like the spring breeze after a long winter. "Clara, I believe what God let me see. And God never brought us together without a reason." She bowed her head, her eyes stinging. "It is not love that burns. It is love that warms like embers kept in a cold stone furnace." And then, as the church doors closed behind them, Clara felt her steps become lighter. Not because the road ahead was easy, but because from now on this long journey she would not walk alone. A new home awaited them on windy Hartman Hill, where their first days as a married couple began with a peace she never thought she deserved. The walk from church to Hartman homestead that afternoon was bathed in fading sunlight, a soft light like a final blessing. Clara sat behind Elias, her arms wrapped around his waist, and her heart so barren for years softened like soil watered for the first time after a long drought. They didn't say much. There was no need to. The silence between them was no longer a gap, but a small bridge connecting two lives that were once strangers. When they arrived, the wooden house appeared in the afternoon light. Its slanted porch, thick, dark walls, and dimly lit windows waiting for them. Bear ran out to greet them, barking loudly, a simple announcement that Hartman Homestead had a new member. Clara walked into the house with the feeling of being handed a blank page. Without being told, she began to straighten the tablecloth, arrange the wildflowers from the wedding bouquet in a cracked ceramic vase, and open the windows to let the late afternoon light stream into the living room. The house, which was once quiet and simple, now had a different feel. A little feminine, a little warm, a little hopeful. As if it was breathing again after a long time, living only in memories of the past. The next day, Clara rose early. She lit the stove, tidied up the kitchen, washed out the old cake pan, and kneaded the dough with the slowness of someone who knows that love comes not from grand gestures but from small, consistent actions. As the scent of baking bread filled the house, Elias stopped in his tracks as he stacked firewood in the yard. He turned around, saw the smoke from the stove rising into the sky, and for a moment he felt something his years of solitude had never given him, a sense of being waited for. He didn't go in right away. He stood there a while longer, just listening to life coming back into the old walls of the house his mother had built. When he entered, he saw Clara placing the cake on the table, her hands still covered in white flour. "It's delicious," he said, knowing without even tasting it. She chuckled softly, a smile that lit up the kitchen. "I just thought, a new house needs to smell like baking," Clara said. "And I just thought," Elias replied, "this house has never been so warm." No confession, just the simple truth. In the days that followed, Clara gradually made Hartman Homestead her home. She didn't change Elias's mother's old things. On the contrary, she cleaned every quilt, rehung the sheer curtain his mother had sewn, and left the old oil lamp by the window in its place because she knew each object carried a memory. She sewed together the frayed seams of Elias's winter coat, mending each button with the practiced hands of someone who had spent years taking care of herself. She tidied up the kitchen, placed a shaker of sea salt by the stove, folded the dish towels neatly, and always kept a pot of hot tea on the table. A little habit from her old life that she didn't want to lose. Every time he returned from the fields, Elias would stop at the window to look in first. He was not a romantic, but the image of Clara standing in the light, her head slightly bowed as she arranged her things, her hand moving her scarf to make it fit, made him feel like he was seeing early spring in the middle of a windy steppe. That man who for years only knew how to look out at the fields to find a reason to continue living now looked inside the house to find peace. One afternoon, while Clara was cleaning out a low wooden chest in Elias's bedroom, now theirs, she discovered a small wooden box tucked away deep inside. It was tied with old hemp rope, and its dusty appearance showed that it had not been used for a long time. Clara hesitated. It belonged to Elias's ex-wife, the woman who had died in the snowstorm that had nearly left him with nothing. She opened the box very gently, almost afraid to break the silence in the room. Inside were old letters, a few small items, a half-embroidered handkerchief, a bone comb, and a faded photograph of a young woman with a gentle smile. Clara touched the edge of the photograph. A slight sadness rose up in her, not jealousy but compassion for a woman she had never met. And then what made her choke up wasn't those souvenirs, but the feeling that she was stepping into a memory area that she wasn't sure she had the right to be in. She closed the box, not letting any dust fall, and placed it respectfully on the table. But when she turned to the door, Elias was already standing there. He looked at the wooden box, then at Clara. His eyes were not cold, not confused, only had a layer of deep sadness of someone who had experienced loss. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "I didn't mean to intrude." Elias stepped in, placing his hand lightly on the box. "It's okay," he said. "I'll need to open it at some point." Clara was silent. Part of her worried was his past, something she had to compete with. Was he thinking more about his ex-wife than about a future with her? Elias realized this, for his tact always preceded his words. He gently lifted the wooden box, then placed it in Clara's hands. "Clara," he said, his voice as soft as the late light outside the window, "the past made me. I owe it to my past for its strength. But my future," he looked deep into her eyes, "it's me. Only me." A simple sentence. But for a woman who had been abandoned by both her family and society, those words touched the deepest fear in her heart, then gently erased it. Clara didn't cry, but her shoulders relaxed in that way only someone who has just unburdened herself can. That evening they ate dinner together by oil lamplight. There was no wine, no music, just the sound of the wind blowing through the eaves and the light clink of knives and spoons on plates. Elias told stories of the previous season's farming, and Clara told stories of the children she had taught, how they had grown, how they had learned to write. He listened attentively to each of her stories without interruption or unnecessary questions. As they washed the dishes, Elias stood next to Clara, his hand occasionally brushing hers accidentally, but enough to make the whole kitchen feel warmer. The ocean of life between the two people was no longer vast and lonely. It had gathered into a small stream, flowing slowly but surely. And in the middle of that quiet evening, Clara realized one thing. Love did not come like a storm, but came like the way Elias looked at her from outside the window, the way he let her choose her own pace of life, the way he talked about the past but still chose her for the future. The man didn't save her. He showed her where to revive. And then, in those peaceful months, something Clara never dared to hope for came knocking on the door, a fragile but miraculous piece of good news, enough to change the rhythm of the entire cabin in the breezy Montana. In the first months after their wedding, life at Hartman Homestead moved at a slow, steady, and peaceful pace, like the breath of the prairie. Clara grew accustomed to the sound of the wind through the cracks in the door each morning, to the sound of Elias's horse's hooves, returning each evening, and to ending the day with a cup of hot tea, to sharing small but soul-filling stories. Yet deep in her heart, Clara still carried an old fear, a fear that many adult women of the time secretly harbored. She thought she would never have children. Not because anyone told her so, but because the years passed too quickly, too silently, and age, like a long shadow, always reminded her that miracles no longer chose her. So when her body started to change, Clara just thought it was fatigue. When the nausea appeared every morning, she tried to hide it. She didn't want Elias to hope, didn't want herself to hope. Hope sometimes was scarier than despair. Until one afternoon, as the red sun crept over the distant mountains, Clara stood on the porch, her hand on her belly, an unconscious but instinctive gesture. And it was then that the truth flashed through her like a fierce flash of light. She was pregnant. Clara shivered, not because of cold, partly because of unexpected happiness, partly because of the fear that such happiness was too fragile to hold on to. Elias stepped out of the stables and saw her standing silently, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Clara," he called, his voice soft but worried. She turned back, her sparkling eyes unable to hide the truth welling up from deep within. "Elias." Her voice trembled like the wind through a thin curtain. Maybe I am pregnant." He was stunned. In the afternoon light, Elias's face showed no strong emotion, as it always did when he faced great things, but around him the air seemed to stop. Then very slowly his eyes lit up the light of faith, of the blessing that he thought God had closed on his life. He walked over, placed his hands on Clara's shoulders, and pulled her into his arms gently. "Clara," he said, his voice low, rich, and warm as the breath of spring earth, whether true or not, "we will face any storm together." Clara was broken into silence by his steadfastness. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart, the rhythm of a man who had learned to love with perseverance, not impulsiveness. Month after month, Clara's belly grew bigger. Soft laughter filled the cabin. Elias added a small chair by the fireplace for whoever was coming to see us. Bear lay at Clara's feet every night, as if he knew something precious was growing in the house. But life on the frontier was never easy. And that winter came early and harsher than usual. The snow was falling heavily, and the wind howled through the roofs like wolves in the woods. Cedar Hollow residents said that the wind from the north was so cold that year that the iron in the yard cracked. Clara was 8 months pregnant when the biggest snowstorm of the season hit. No one could leave their homes. The road to town was blocked by snow, and Hartman Homestead was completely cut off in a sea of white. Elias never left Clara's side. He piled more wood in the house, heated the water, checked every air vent, but the weather was relentless. Just as the storm was at its strongest, Clara went into labor. The pain made her double over her hands, clutching the edge of the bed. The wind howled outside as if it were tearing the roof off the house. Elias paled. He had faced death, faced loss, but never this fear. He knew someone had to help. "I'll call Mrs. Hankins," he said, his voice breathless with anxiety. "No, Elias." Clara gripped his hand tightly. "You can't go out now. The wind will blow you away." Elias looked out the window. White snowflakes were flying wildly, obscuring everything. But he still couldn't bear to stand still. "I have to do something," he said, his voice almost pleading. Clara nodded, sweat beading her forehead, her breathing ragged. "I'm here. That's all. And a small miracle happens when the world outside becomes too violent. The world inside the house becomes quiet and focused." Elias ran to get clean towels, hot water, and thick blankets. Bear barked as if calling for help. But then as the wind shook the door, a knock came in. It was Mrs. Hankins, the neighbor half a mile away. Her face was red from the cold wind, but her eyes were determined. "I knew she was due today," she said, waving her hand when Elias tried to thank her. "The heavens may be angry, but I will not abandon her." She asked Elias to light more stoves, block the stove with sacks, and keep the oil lamps burning brightly. The howling wind outside mixed with Clara's painful groans. But beside her, Elias did not let go of her hand for a second. "You are not alone," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "Never." Clara struggled to breathe, fought through the pain. And then, amid the howling of the storm, amid the creaking of the wood, the baby's first cry rang out. A small sound. Weak, but enough to tear apart both the storm outside and the storm within them. "Mrs. Hankins picked up the baby wrapped in a thick blanket and handed it to Clara. Strong as a newborn calf, she smiled. A warrior now. Clara looked at the child in her arms, tiny red but alive as a winter fire. Her tears fell not from pain but from something she had never dared to name: complete happiness. Elias sat down beside her, bowed his head, and gently touched his forehead to his wife and child's. His hand shook, but not from the cold. "Clara." "You did it," he said, his voice choking. "No," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "We can do it." The storm lasted for 2 more days. But in that wooden house where 3 people lay side by side under the warm yellow light of an oil lamp, no fear could penetrate. Clara had thought that at her age all miracles were over. But now, holding the baby in her arms, she knew some miracles come late. But when they do come, they are big enough to fill the rest of your life. And it was the birth of that child in the midst of the most violent storm Cedar Hollow had ever seen that made the townspeople look at the Hartmans in a different light. Little did they know that Clara would become the slow-burning flame that would warm a community accustomed to enduring hardship. The storm that year left traces on Cedar Hollow deeper than the melting snow traces that made people look at life with slower, more precious eyes. When news spread that Clara had given birth in the middle of the snowstorm and that the child had lived as vigorously as the first spring grass, the community began to look at Hartman Homestead with different eyes, less critical, less prejudiced. And like the miracles of the frontier, the change didn't come suddenly. It came in small steps, simple acts, things Clara did without thinking they would change anyone. After recovering, Clara began teaching literacy to children in the mountains in a small room next to the kitchen. It wasn't a grand plan. One morning she saw some children passing by the fence, bundles of firewood in their arms, their eyes following the letters, she wrote in her notebook. When she smiled, they timidly asked her to teach them how to write their names. That's it. But sometimes the most important things come from small moments like that. At first there were only 3, the Kowalski's children on the hill. Then, the blacksmith's children, and the children of the hired men on the berry farm. And soon, every afternoon in Clara's cabin, there was the sound of reading aloud, the sound of laughter that made the weariness of the day disappear. Mrs. Lehman, who had been making fun of Clara, passed by the window and saw the scene without saying a word. But something in her face softened as if a knot had been pulled loose. Elias, standing in the yard, looked out the window to see his wife bent over her desk, her brown hair tilted slightly in the light of the oil lamp. She was so patient that he thought if kindness had a form, it would look like the figure of that woman on a cool afternoon. "You did well," he said as she packed up her books early in the evening. Clara smiled, her eyes gentle and a little shy. "I just do what I know," she replied. "And it seems this town needs someone who believes the kids have a future." Elias placed his hand on her back, gentle but firm. "It's not just the kids, Clara. You've got the whole town believing it." The change was more evident one morning when Martha Lehman, a woman known for her bluntness and sharp wit, knocked on the door of Hartman homestead. This time, it wasn't to make a sarcastic remark. Her face was a little wary, which was rare. Clara opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Lehman," she said, her voice calm. Mrs. Lehman fingered the handkerchief in her hand as if searching for words. I heard you were teaching the children," she began. "My daughter. She seems slower than the others. She needs someone like you." Clara was touched by the sincerity, not because it was acknowledged, but because Mrs. Lehman had the courage to put aside her pride and hope for her daughter. "Of course," Clara said, squeezing her hand gently, "all children deserve to know how to read and write." Mrs. Lehman sighed as if a burden had been lifted. "Thank you, Clara. Perhaps I was too harsh and didn't see you correctly." Clara just smiled. Change always begins when we dare to look back right. That day, Cedar Hollow began to look at Clara, with no doubt in its eyes. She had nothing to prove, no need to justify her age or her past. Her patience and presence spoke for themselves, but it wasn't the literacy class that really changed the town. It was the plague that came in late spring. A strange fever spread from the families living on the edge of the forest. Within 2 weeks, nearly a third of the town was sick. The doctors had to go to other areas, and only a few people knew how to care for them. Without hesitation, Clara opened the Hartman homestead door like a quick aid station. She made ginger tea, decocted herbs from the woods Elias's mother had left in the wooden cabinet, and went from house to house without hesitation, even though the wind was still cold, as if it wanted to keep winter here. Elias was always by her side, bringing fresh water, firewood, or helping the sick out onto the porch to help them breathe. There was no laughter from the children in those days, only coughs, groans, and sighs in the darkness. But Clara did not back down for a moment. She cared for her childless mother. She covered the children with warm towels whose cheeks were red with fever. She sat all night beside the man who had once mocked her the most, wiping his sweat with a warm towel and whispering words of comfort. And that's what made the town quiet. They realized the woman they had laughed at was the one keeping the last warmth for Cedar Hollow during the epidemic. Many people thought that she was weak and old, but no one expected the perseverance of a woman who had endured so much loneliness to be so strong. During the long nights, Elias watched Clara go from one hospital bed to another with light steps, and in his eyes she was like an oil lamp in the windy season. "Don't you get tired doing that?" he asked, his voice hoarse with worry. Clara shook her head. "It's been years. This is the first time I felt truly useful." Elias placed his hand on her shoulder, a firm hand, as if to say he saw everything. "You've always been helpful, Clara," he said. "It's just that this town takes time to realize it." The plague passed, leaving Cedar Hollow exhausted but grateful. No one died, and that was largely due to Clara's dogged care. From that day on, whenever Clara walked down the street, people bowed first, not out of politeness, but out of respect. An old blacksmith said to Elias when they met on the road, "Mr. Hartman, God sent her to this town, didn't he?" Elias just smiled lightly, his voice as low as the afternoon wind. "I think God sent her to me first. As for the town, it was an added blessing." Mrs. Lehman brought Clara a handkerchief she had sewn herself, a simple but heartfelt gift. She said, "You've helped this whole town get back on its feet. No one laughs at you anymore, Clara." No one. Clara smiled, her eyes as soft as an early June morning. "I don't expect respect, Mrs. Lehman. I just want this place to live a little better." And the town knew she was right. She didn't do it to be liked. She did it because it was her nature to be kind without conditions. Elias watched Clara from the porch, the long twilight washing the dirt road in gold. She was talking to a group of children, leading them through a short passage from the Bible. His heart was silent and grateful. Clara didn't just change Hartman homestead. She changed Cedar Hollow. And he knew in those changes she had also found what she had been searching for all her life, a place where she belonged. And so, The years passed as gently as clouds drifting over the mountains. Children grew, the seasons changed, the Cedar Hollow community grew closer. And at Hartman Homestead, Clara and Elias's love quietly aged with time but never faded. The years after the plague and the birth of their first child passed like a stream flowing slowly through a mountain stream, no noise, no rush, just steady and gentle. At Hartman Homestead, each season followed another, like a chapter in a long book that Clara and Elias knew they were lucky to be writing together. The first child grew up healthy. Then the second, then the third came in belated but abundant blessings. Cedar Hollow grew accustomed to the Hartman children's laughter echoing from the porch to the pines behind. And Clara, who had thought her heart past blooming, lived in a warm garden. Summer followed summer, winter followed winter. The children grew up, learned to ride horses, lit stoves, and went to work on the farm. And one day Clara realized the children who used to hold her hand while learning to write were now almost as tall as Elias. Time, no matter how slow, always moves on. Clara and Elias passed through middle age as lightly as the wind passing through the eaves. They did not fight time, nor did they blame it. They just lived one day at a time, and then one day, looking into the window glass, they realized that their hair was streaked with gray. But if there was one thing that remained constant, it was their smiles whenever they looked at each other, the same peaceful smiles as the day they stood before Silver Lake all those years ago. One by one, the children left home, as all frontier children did. They went to town to learn trades, join the railroad corps, or start families on other farms. Hartman Homestead gradually returned to its usual quiet. Some people fear that silence, but for Clara and Elias, it is simply the natural rhythm of life. A rhythm they cherish equally when the house is full and when they are alone. Montana afternoons are always at their most beautiful when the sun begins to dip behind the Bitterroot Mountains. The red-orange light slides down the roofs and trees, finally settling on the ground like warm honey. For Clara, that moment is a gentle reminder that another day has passed in its entirety. And every afternoon without fail, Elias pulled the wooden chair out onto the porch and placed it next to his wife's chair. No matter how busy he was, he always returned right before the sun was about to set, as if he didn't want to miss the moment when they both looked towards the mountains where time passed but love stood still. Elias was usually a man of few words, especially as he got older. But there was one habit he kept from their early years together. Every dusk he would gently run his hand through Clara's hair, which was now more silver than brown. One such afternoon, as the last light of day reflected in Clara's eyes, Elias whispered, "You are still as beautiful as the first day I met you." He paused briefly, then added, his voice as deep as the earth, "You are still timeless, Clara." She smiled, placing her wrinkled hand on his. "Elias, time has changed us a lot." He shook his head slightly. "No, Clara, time only reveals what is, but love remains the same." There was no music in that moment, no wind, nothing but a deep calm, a calm that only hearts that have weathered storms can understand the value of. Clara, looking at Elias and at the life behind, felt an emotion that young people rarely name but old people understand well: gratitude. Grateful that life did not abandon her. Grateful that love, though late still, found her at the right time. Grateful that her remaining years will no longer be a lonely journey. Many nights when Elias was asleep, Clara would sit by the window, looking out at the vast sky, and wonder, what if she hadn't gotten off the train to Cedar Hollow that day? What if she had turned away from Elias's outstretched hand on the platform? Would life have been different? She dared not imagine. Because sometimes happiness comes from taking one step, just one step, out of the darkness of the past. Elias had a habit of calling her by her shorter, more intimate name whenever they talked at length in the evening. "A person like you," he had said as they cleared the table after dinner, "when you came into this world, God must have left a gentle part in his hand." Clara laughed. "I'm not as gentle as people think." "I know," Elias replied, "and that's why I love you all the more." As the couple grew older, they stopped doing the heavy work. Elias left most of the farm to the children, while Clara spent more time sewing old quilts, reading to the town children, or making tea for visitors. And sometimes in the quietest moments they tell each other untold stories, heartbreaking memories, losses they have learned to leave behind. Each story brings them closer together, like two old trees leaning on each other to stand firm against winter. The town children began calling Clara Miss Clara and Elias Old Man Hartman, but affectionately, without a trace of sarcasm. To them they were the anchor of Cedar Hollow, a couple as gentle as a June sunset. And for them, love had become a peaceful, wordless habit, like the way they sat quietly next to each other every afternoon waiting for the sun to set behind the mountains. One day, as they were sitting together like this, Clara said very softly, "Elias, are you afraid of aging?" He looked at her with eyes as deep as the earth after the rain. "No," he replied, "because old age, like sunsets, is best seen with someone else." Clara took his hand. Ninth. Their hands felt like two pieces of old wood, rough, knotty, but incredibly strong. "I am grateful for life, Elias," she whispered. "Grateful that my last years were no longer lonely." He leaned his head on her shoulder so lightly that only long-time lovers could understand. "You've never been lonely, Clara," he said. "You just haven't met the right person to go with." The gentle afternoon breeze rustled across the fields, and their smiles, though time had silvered their hair, their skin, their once full features, remained as intact as that fateful afternoon by Silver Lake. Love at that age is no longer a blazing fire. It is an ember, smoldering, enduring, warm enough to keep them together until the very end. And when winter came again, bringing white snow to the wooden roof, Clara and Elias had no idea that their lives were about to enter their final chapter. A chapter as peaceful as the way they had lived, leaving their children and grandchildren. A reminder that love is not measured by age, but by the depth of the years spent together. When winter came, Cedar Hollow wore a thick but gentle white coat, as if nature wanted to slow down and listen to the stories told by the old but warm breath. The wind carried the smell of pine resin, and the gray sky was as still as an unwritten page. It was the winter that the Hartman descendants, though scattered across Montana, returned to Hartman Homestead like small rivers, finding a single source. From a distance, Elias and Clara's wooden house looked like a glowing ember in the snow, with smoke rising from the chimney. Children ran around the yard, leaving uneven footprints. Their laughter echoed, melting into the cold air, then breaking into strangely warm pieces. Clara stood on the porch, her hands clasped in the old woolen scarf that was taken out every winter. Her cheeks were lined with fine, thread-like wrinkles. Each wrinkle seemed to hold a winter, a summer, a memory of her life with Elias. Her eyes were soft and deep, like Silver Lake on a windless day. In the front yard, Elias was playing with his grandchildren. He was no longer as agile as when he was young, but his laughter was still full and round, like a bronze bell that never tarnished. When the children climbed on his legs, he pretended to fall down, letting them squeal with delight. The sight made Clara stand still for a long time, her eyes sparkling under the thin white layer of winter mist. She quietly asked herself a question that only she could hear. Was God so generous in bringing that man into my life? Perhaps it was true, because Clara knew from the day she stepped off the train to Cedar Hollow she had found the path that would lead her to a destination that for years she thought few people would give to a woman past her prime. A moment later, Elias came up the steps, his hands still covered in snow. "You're standing there thinking again," he said, his voice both teasing and affectionate. Clara smiled, the small smile of a woman who has loved a man so much that her heart is at peace in his presence. "It's just, I'm looking at how far we've come." Elias placed his hand on her shoulder, holding it gently as he had for more than 3 decades. "So far that time can no longer catch up with us," he replied. The evening came earlier than usual. As the sun set behind the Bitterroot Mountains, the farm was bathed in a pale purple light that spread like a fine cloth. In the log cabin, children gathered around the fireplace, adults telling stories, children falling asleep in their mothers' laps, the crackling of wood a backdrop to the reunion. Clara and Elias sat at the wooden table, drinking herbal tea that their grandmother had brewed the month before. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Some bonds were so strong that a single look could last a lifetime. As the children dragged Elias outside again to make a snowman, Clara stood in the doorway watching. The moonlight reflected off his silver hair, making it shine like the first frost on a pine forest. And in that moment her heart clenched with a gratitude so deep it was almost sacred. I was late to love Clara ni doi mat kk, but love was right on time. That sentence was not meant to be told to anyone. It was just a reminder to herself, a confirmation that even though she came to love late, love still recognized her like the last ray of light at the end of the day, recognizing where it needs to stop. As the weather grew colder, the family went inside. Only the 2 old people remained on the porch as they did every evening. The wind was not strong, but it was enough to send a few snowflakes swaying in the air, falling like little musical notes on the roof. Elias pulled the wooden chair closer to Clara. "Are you cold?" he asked. "No," she replied, "because I'm sitting next to you." He chuckled softly, then reached out to hold her hand, a hand that had been calloused by seasons of working in the land. They had once trembled with fear, had ached with loss, had clenched with hope, and now they only trembled slightly because they were held in the hand of the one he loved most. "Clara," Elias said, his voice carried a little by the wind, but still clear as the old oath. "We lived a good life, didn't we?" Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "A life I never dared to dream of," she whispered. Elias smiled, then said the words he had been saying to her every time the sun set for decades, as a reminder that time, though cruel, could not touch the most important thing. "We are timeless." Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes closed in the rare peace of old age. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft as a breath. "We transcend time, because we transcend our own fears." The snow began to fall more heavily. The snowflakes gently landed on the wooden roof on the shoulders of two people who had gone through more than the challenges that life on the border could ever pose. The snow covered the ups and downs, the old footsteps, the traces of time, but could not cover the warmth of two hearts sitting next to each other. Inside the house, the laughter of children and grandchildren echoed as evidence that Clara and Elias' love had become the foundation not just of a family but of a way of life. To live kindly, to live slowly, to live meaningfully. Cedar Hollow has long ceased to be the place Clara feared she did not belong. Now it is home to a lifetime of lasting love. As the two old people sat there hand in hand, their breaths mingling in the cold Montana air, time seemed to stand still for a moment, giving way to a moment of complete peace. No background music, no majestic words, just the snow falling gently on the wooden roof, falling like a final blessing for a love that has gone all the way but is still intact as in the beginning. And their story ends the way beautiful stories always end. No drama, no pain, with just enough tenderness to leave the listener speechless. Love is not measured by age. Love is measured by depth. And so in that wild borderland, the love of two people who were once overlooked by life quietly became a fire that warmed many generations. A proof that sometimes miracles do not lie in perfect beginnings, but in being brave enough to believe in each other until the end. The story of Clara Whitmore and Elias Hartman is not just a love story of two people who have been hurt. It is a gentle reminder that age never defines the value of a heart. We may be late to love, late to happiness, late to faith, but if we still live kindly, still dare to open our hearts, then happiness will always know how to find its way to us at the right time. Clara thought her life was over, but it was her perseverance, gentleness, and quiet kindness, things no one else immediately saw, that helped her not only find love but also become a pillar of strength for an entire community. And Elias, with his Midwestern calm, reminds us that to love someone is to see the beauty in them, even when the world doesn't yet see it. In today's life, amidst the pressures and strict standards, perhaps the biggest lesson from this story is, be kind, be patient, and never give up on your second chance. Because sometimes what we think is late is actually the most perfect time. Thank you for accompanying this humane story. If you find the video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring healing and warm stories from the ancient border. See you on the next journeys.